Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist summary. A shepherd boy named Santiago retires for the night in an abandoned church with his flock of sheep. This is where Santiago falls asleep and dreams a recurring dream. The next morning, Santiago talks to his sheep about the unnamed Andalusian girl he is in love with. Santiago will see this girl in a few days, when he sells his flock's wool to her merchant father. Because his parents wanted him to become a priest, Santiago has studied Latin, Spanish and theology in a seminary, but he ended his studies prematurely, desiring instead to travel the world. That is why he became a shepherd. On his way to see the merchant and his daughter, Santiago visits the village of Tarifa. There he meets an old woman who interprets dreams, which she says are the language of God. Santiago recounts his recurring dream to the old woman. He is in a field with his flock when visited by a child who transports him to the pyramids in Egypt. There, the child says, Santiago will find a hidden treasure. Each time Santiago is about to find out the specific location of the treasure, though, he wakes up. The old woman tells Santiago that she will interpret his dream on one condition: she won't charge him any money, but Santiago has to share with her 1/10 of any treasure he finds. Santiago agrees. The old woman says the dream is in what she calls the language of the world, and that Santiago needs to travel to the pyramids, where he will find a treasure that will make him rich. Because the old woman's interpretation is so straightforward, Santiago leaves her house upset and disappointed. He claims that he will never again believe in dreams. At the local market, Santiago trades his old book for a new one, and just as he is becoming absorbed in it, an old man asks him what he is reading. When Santiago shows it to him, the old man says that the book is important but irritating. The old man goes on to say that the book describes its characters' inability to choose their own personal legend. He also says that everyone in the book believes the world's greatest lie, that as people get older, they lose control of their futures and their lives are directed only by fate. When Santiago asks where he's from, the old man replies that he's from many places but was born in a place called Salem, of which he is king. His name, he says, is Melchizedek. He offers to help Santiago find the hidden treasure in exchange for 1/10 of his sheep. Then Melchizedek writes in the sand the name of Santiago's hometown, his parents' names, and the name of the merchant's daughter. While he is writing, Melchizedek's cape falls open, revealing a blinding light. Melchizedek explains that Santiago has discovered his personal legend, which he defines as what you have always wanted to accomplish. According to Melchizedek, every young person knows what his or her personal legend is. It is only as they get older that a mysterious force convinces people that personal legends are impossible to achieve. This mysterious force isn't exactly negative, since it prepares a person's spirit and will so that he or she can understand the one great truth on this planet. This truth is that, when you really want something, it's because that desire originated in the soul of the universe. Fulfilling that desire, which means fulfilling your personal legend, is everyone's purpose, Melchizedek explains. The soul of the world is fed by people's happiness, he goes on. In fact, a person's only real responsibility is to realize his or her destiny. And when you want something, Melchizedek concludes, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. Melchizedek tells Santiago that he visited him just when Santiago was about to abandon his personal legend, searching for and finding a hidden treasure. Melchizedek always visits just when a person is about to abandon his personal legend. But Melchizedek, the king of Salem, doesn't always appear as a person. Sometimes, when people are about to abandon their goals and dreams, he appears to them as the solution to a problem or a good idea, or he just makes things easier to achieve. Melchizedek and Santiago arrange to meet at the same time the next day. Santiago will give Melchizedek 1/10 of his flock, and Melchizedek will tell Santiago how to find the hidden treasure. After his exchange with Melchizedek, however, Santiago walks to a ticket counter where he considers buying a ticket to Africa. Ultimately he decides against it. Santiago and Melchizedek meet again, and Santiago expresses his surprise that the same friend who was housing his sheep has agreed to buy all the sheep that Melchizedek isn't purchasing. Melchizedek tells Santiago that this is called the principle of favorability, otherwise known as beginner's luck. The king of Salem explains that a force wants us to realize our personal legends, and beginner's luck gives us a hint of what success might feel like. Melchizedek tells Santiago that the treasure is in Egypt, near the pyramids, and that he can find it by following the omens. Melchizedek opens his cape and removes one black stone and one white stone from the center of his breastplate, which he says are called Urim and Thummim. The black stone stands for yes and the white stone for no, he says, advising Santiago to rely on the stones when he can't read the omens. Melchizedek gives Santiago 2 further pieces of advice: don't forget the language of omens, and don't forget to follow your personal legend through to its conclusion. When he bids Santiago farewell, Melchizedek recalls giving advice to Abraham and apologizes to God for his vanity. Santiago crosses the Strait of Gibraltar and finds himself in Tangier, a city in northern Morocco, where a man he meets in a bar swindles him out of all his money. As a result of this unfortunate occurrence, Santiago realizes that he is like everyone else. I see the world in terms of what I would like to see happen and not what actually does. He decides to think positively, to consider himself an adventurer rather than a victim. In desperate need of money, Santiago is hired by a crystal merchant, who tells him that even a year's wages would not pay his way to Egypt, which is thousands of kilometers distant. The crystal merchant offers to give Santiago enough money to return to Andalusia. But Santiago declines the offer, telling the crystal merchant that he'll work for him to earn money with which to buy sheep. After Santiago has worked for 1 month at the crystal merchant's shop, Santiago offers to build a display case for the crystal, which the merchant can put outside his shop to attract potential customers. The crystal merchant fears that passers-by will bump into it and break the glass. Santiago responds that business has improved since he began working at the store and that the merchant should take advantage of this trend. He explains the idea, learned from the King of Salem, of moving when luck is on one side, the principle of favorability. After 2 more months, with the display case in place outside the store having generated an enormous amount of new business, Santiago figures that if he returns home with all the money he has made, he can double his flock in less than a year. Also, he can trade with the Arabs in Tangier or in Spain, because he has learned to speak Arabic. Hearing a tourist complain of thirst after climbing the hill to the crystal shop, Santiago suggests to the crystal merchant that they sell tea and serve it in the crystal, which in turn will help them sell more crystal. Meanwhile, Santiago's aspirations have encouraged the merchant to recall his own abandoned dreams. He uses the word that will feature prominently in this section of the novel, maktub, meaning it is written. In Western terms, maktub means that something is destined, meant to be. Santiago and the crystal merchant offer tea at the store, and their venture is a huge financial success. After 11 months and 9 days in Tangier, Santiago has earned enough money to buy 120 sheep, a return ticket to Andalusia, and a license to import products from Africa. The crystal merchant has made enough to travel to Mecca, one of his own life's aspirations. But the merchant tells Santiago, "You know that I'm not going to go to Mecca. Just as you know that you're not going to buy your sheep." The merchant is right. When the stones Urim and Thummim spill out of Santiago's jacket, he recalls Melchizedek and his teachings. Santiago realizes that he will always be able to return to Andalusia and the life of a shepherd, but he will not always be able to visit the Egyptian pyramids. He decides to forge onward in pursuit of his personal legend. We now meet a 4th important character, the Englishman. The Englishman spent a decade at a university trying to find the one true language of the universe. Before traveling to northern Africa, he studied Esperanto, an international language, then religions of the world, and finally alchemy. To the Englishman's dismay, however, the alchemists he has met won't teach him what he wants to know, perhaps, he conjectures, because they don't know it themselves. Surrounded by thick books, he awaits the departure of a caravan for Egypt. He hopes to travel through the Sahara Desert to the Al Fayoum oasis on the way there, reportedly the home of a 200-year-old alchemist who can turn any metal into gold. After meeting the Englishman, Santiago removes Urim and Thummim from his pocket and is surprised when the Englishman shouts their names. The Englishman tells Santiago that the stones aren't valuable, then removes 2 identical stones from his own pocket. Santiago tells him that the stones came from a king, a fact which the Englishman is not surprised to learn. It was shepherds who were the first to recognize a king that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge, he says. The Englishman tells Santiago that Urim and Thummim were the only form of divination permitted by God. The priests carried them in a golden breastplate. He speculates that this may be an omen, telling Santiago that everything in life is an omen. The Englishman also tells Santiago that he is in search of a universal language. Santiago and the Englishman join the caravan, which consists of over 200 people. Just before they leave, the Englishman says there's no such thing as coincidence. Santiago reflects that the closer one gets to realizing his personal legend, the more that personal legend becomes his true reason for being. Crossing the desert with the caravan, Santiago wonders if he is learning the universal language that deals with the past and the present of all people. Santiago's mother referred to this knowledge as a hunch, while the crystal merchant used the term maktub, it is written. It could also be called intuition. Santiago throws his book away once he realizes that he will learn more from the caravan and the camel driver and also by observing his own camel. At night, the camel driver tells Santiago about his former life as a farmer outside Cairo with an orchard full of fruit. He had children and land and he took an opportunity to make the same pilgrimage to Mecca that the crystal merchant spoke of. The Nile flooded its banks, however, destroying his fruit trees and forcing him to become a camel driver. As a result, he learned a painful but important lesson: there is no need to fear the unknown if you can achieve what you need to survive. Because of the threat of danger, the caravan starts to travel faster and more quietly. The caravan leader decides that they should no longer light a fire after dark. One night, when the Englishman can't sleep, he asks Santiago about his experiences with the crystal merchant and is impressed by what he hears. That's the principle that governs all things, the Englishman explains. In alchemy, it's called the soul of the world. When you want something with all your heart, that's when you are closest to the soul of the world. It's always a positive force. Santiago tries to read the Englishman's books. They are strange books, however, covering the properties of mercury and salt, discussing kings and dragons. And they assert one proposition above all others, that all things are the manifestation of one thing only. In fact, the most significant text in all of alchemy consists of only a few lines once etched on the surface of an emerald. If the truth of everything is written on the surface of a single precious stone, Santiago wonders, why do people need to read so many big books? The one book that interests Santiago the most tells the life stories of famous alchemists, who dedicated their lives to purifying metals. These alchemists believed that if they heated a metal for many years, it would free itself of its individual properties, leaving behind the soul of the world. The soul of the world allowed alchemists to understand everything on earth, since it was the language with which all things communicated. The alchemists called the discovery of this language the master work. Santiago learns that the master work is composed of two parts, one liquid and one solid. It is unclear how something can be liquid and solid as well as a language and also a soul. The liquid portion is known as the elixir of life, which cures illnesses and is responsible for keeping alchemists young. The solid part of the master work is called the Philosopher's Stone, a small sliver of which is all that's needed to turn any metal into gold. Everyone in the caravan is on edge, wary of anything that might hint of a raid by one of the warring desert tribes. Only Santiago's friend, the camel driver, seems unconcerned. He tells the shepherd boy the reason he is unafraid of the war between the tribes is because he lives only in the present. If you can concentrate always on the present, you'll be a happy man, he says. Life will be a party for you, a grand festival, because life is the moment we're living right now. The next morning, Santiago awakens to see rows of date palms stretching across the entire desert where previously he had seen only stars. The Englishman is relieved to have reached the oasis. He can now find the alchemist. Santiago thinks about his treasure, and how far off it still remains. He notices that the closer he comes to realizing his dream, the more distant it seems. Meanwhile, the alchemist is watching. He notices the overwhelming happiness of the travelers, who appreciate the sudden greenery of the oasis. Maybe God created the desert so that man could appreciate the date palms, he thinks. He then decides to focus his attention on more practical matters. Omens have told the alchemist that an important man arrived with the caravan. He is supposed to teach this man the secrets of alchemy. The camel driver tells Santiago that an oasis is considered neutral territory because it is populated mostly by women and children. The warring tribes fight in the desert and leave the oasis alone. Because an oasis cannot harbor troops, all the travelers from the caravan have to surrender their weapons. Santiago and the Englishman ask a black-veiled woman and several men about the alchemist. All claim not to know his exact whereabouts. They do, though, refer to the alchemist as both a witch doctor and the very powerful one. Santiago next approaches a pretty young woman by a well. Her head is covered, but not her face. Instead of asking her where the alchemist lives, Santiago is struck dumb. At that moment, it seemed to him that time stood still, and the soul of the world surged within him. He learned the most important part of the language that all the world spoke, the language that everyone on earth was capable of understanding in their heart. It was love. Prodded by the Englishman, Santiago puts aside his feelings for the girl, whose name is Fatima, and asks her where the man who cures people's illnesses lives. Fatima points to the south. The Englishman then disappears to find the alchemist, and Fatima leaves with her water. Santiago remains at the well, thinking about her. He knows instinctively that his love for Fatima will enable him to discover every treasure in the world. Santiago returns to the well the next day hoping to find Fatima. Instead, he encounters the Englishman, who found the alchemist and told him that he wanted to learn the secrets of alchemy. The alchemist asked if he had ever turned lead into gold. No, the Englishman said, that was what he had come to the oasis to learn. He told me I should try and do so. After the Englishman departs, Fatima arrives at the well. Santiago tells her that he loves her and wants her to be his wife. Fatima drops her jug and spills some water. After a month at the oasis, the caravan leader calls all the travelers together and tells them that because the tribal war is still raging, they won't be able to travel any further. Santiago searches for the Englishman and discovers that he has built a wood-burning furnace outside his tent. The Englishman tells Santiago that he is completing the first phase of alchemy, separating out the sulfur. To do this, a person can't be afraid of failure, and that fear is what kept the Englishman from trying to accomplish the masterwork. After the sun sets, Santiago explores the desert, hoping it will tell him whether or not he should continue his quest. Soon he sees two hawks flying in the sky. When one hawk attacks another, Santiago envisions an army attacking the oasis. Later, Santiago tells the chieftains who run the oasis of his vision. The chieftains wonder why the desert would reveal its secrets to a stranger. Santiago says that the desert told him its secrets because his eyes are fresh, and he can see things that others might take for granted. Santiago is told that men of the oasis will arm themselves. Because of Sant's tendency to ruin firearms, though, if at least one gun isn't used by sundown the next day, a gun will be used on Santiago. Still, Santiago remains relieved that he shared his vision. Walking back to his tent, Santiago encounters a black-clad horseman with a falcon on his left shoulder. The horseman wears a turban, and a black covering across his face leaves only his eyes visible. He sits atop a huge white horse that rears up on its hind legs. The horseman pulls a sword from its scabbard and demands, "Who dares to read the meaning of the flight of the hawks?" The horseman presses the sword against Santiago's forehead, drawing a small drop of blood. Santiago has no fear of dying, however, as doing so would allow him to join the soul of the world. Santiago explains that he is only following his personal legend, which pacifies the stranger. He puts his sword away and tells Santiago, "I had to test your courage, the quality most essential to understanding the language of the world." Santiago has just met the alchemist. The following day, the Al Fayoum oasis is invaded by 500 mounted tribesmen. At first they appear to be unarmed, but their weapons are hidden under their robes. They converge on the tribal chieftain's tent and attack it. But the tribal leaders, having heeded Santiago's warning, have abandoned the white and gold tent. They surround the desert horsemen and kill all but one of the invaders. That man, commander of the warriors, says that his men were starving and attacked the oasis only so they could eat its food and drink its water before returning to their tribal war. The tribal chieftain tells the commander that he violated a sacred tradition, and is therefore sentenced to death. The next day, Santiago is presented with 50 pieces of gold and asked to be the counselor of the oasis. The alchemist says that the wind told him Santiago was coming and would need help. He instructs Santiago to sleep well, trade his camel for a horse, and remember that his treasure will be where his heart is. The alchemist tells Santiago not to think about what he's leaving behind, explaining that everything is written in the soul of the world, and there it will stay forever. The alchemist describes the emerald tablet, drawing in the sand with a stick to show Santiago what is written on the tablet. The emerald tablet is a direct passage to the soul of the world, he says. The wise men understood that this natural world is only an image and a copy of paradise, a guarantee that there exists a world that is perfect. Santiago chooses not to accept the offer of the tribal chieftain. Instead, he and the alchemist ride their horses across the desert. The two men set out the next night. The alchemist tells Santiago to show him signs of life in the desert, since only those who can see such signs of life are able to find treasure. Santiago lets his horse run free, allowing the animal to gallop for almost 30 minutes before it finally stops near a hole inside which is a cobra. The alchemist pulls it out by its tail. He says it is an omen and decides to lead Santiago to the pyramids. Santiago arranges a meeting with Fatima. He tells her that he loves her, and they embrace. Fatima instinctively understands Santiago in his quest. Her unconditional love enables her to allow him to follow his dream, as Fatima knows he will return. Fatima's generosity will be a source of strength for Santiago as he journeys onward, attempting to accomplish his personal legend. Santiago and the alchemist continue silently to cross the desert towards the pyramids. The alchemist advises Santiago to listen to his heart, despite the fear that Santiago's heart often expresses. Santiago learns to understand what his heart is telling him, and to listen to it patiently, despite the fact that the heart is often fearful. 3 armed warriors approach them, asking what they are doing in the area. The alchemist answers that he is hunting with his falcon. The tribesmen look through their belongings for weapons and, finding none, they let Santiago and the alchemist pass. Later, 2 ominous-looking men appear on horseback and tell the alchemist and Santiago that they may not go any further. The alchemist stares them down, and the tribesmen let them pass. Soon, however, Santiago senses danger, and when he looks into the distance, he sees an army of blue-veiled men. Santiago and the alchemist are taken to a military camp, where they are thought to be spies. The alchemist says that they are just simple travelers and introduces Santiago as an alchemist, saying he understands the forces of nature. And he wants to show you his extraordinary powers. The tribal commander says that he wants to see Santiago perform alchemy. The alchemist answers that in 3 days, Santiago will transform himself into the wind. If he can't do so, the alchemist tells them, "We humbly offer you our lives, for the honor of your tribe." Santiago is furious. How can the alchemist have set him up to do something of which he is incapable? The alchemist calmly explains that if a person is living out his personal legend, he knows everything he needs to know. There is only one thing that makes a dream impossible to achieve: the fear of failure. On the day before he is expected to turn himself into the wind, Santiago climbs to the top of a cliff. He looks out at the desert and senses that it can feel his fear. On the third day, Santiago brings the tribal chief and his officers to the cliff. Again he looks across the desert, and this time Santiago asks for the desert's help in becoming the wind. The desert replies that it can provide its sand to help the wind blow, but no more. The desert needs assistance from the wind itself. Soon, a breeze tickles Santiago's face. The wind knows what the boy needs but regretfully tells him, "We're two very different things." Santiago has learned much from the alchemist, however. He protests that he and the wind aren't very different at all. For one thing, they share the same soul. Intrigued, the wind nevertheless insists that people can't turn themselves into the wind. Sensing that the wind might ultimately relent and grant his wish, Santiago tells it, "When you are loved, you can do anything in creation. When you are loved, there's no need at all to understand what's happening because everything happens within you, and even men can turn themselves into the wind. As long as the wind helps, of course." Suggesting that Santiago ask heaven for help, the wind then creates an enormous sandstorm called a summum. Now Santiago beseeches the sun to help him turn into the wind, for the sake of love, he says. The sun acknowledges that it knows about love. Then the sun complains that people always want more, implying that this is a bad thing. Santiago disagrees, saying that each thing has to transform itself into something better, and to acquire a new personal legend, until, someday, the soul of the world becomes one thing only. The sun decides to transform itself into something better, a brighter sun. The eavesdropping wind then decides to blow harder. Still the sun can't turn Santiago himself into the wind. "Speak to the hand that wrote all," the sun finally suggests. Santiago begins to pray, and in praying he understands that he isn't alone in not comprehending the universe completely. The sun and the wind and the desert also don't entirely know their reason for being. Finally, Santiago reached through to the soul of the world, and saw that it was a part of the soul of God. And he saw that the soul of God was his own soul. And that he, a boy, could perform miracles. Once he is connected to the soul of God, Santiago is indeed able to transform himself into the wind, becoming the mightiest windstorm in anyone's memory. The alchemist is pleased, the tribal commander is impressed, and Santiago is relieved. His life is spared and he can continue to pursue his personal legend and find the hidden treasure. The general provides the alchemist and Santiago with a guide to escort them out of the encampment. The three men travel for an entire day. At the end of the day, they come upon a Coptic Christian monastery. The alchemist uses the monastery's kitchen to perform the art of alchemy. After he has successfully turned lead into gold, the alchemist splits the gold into 4 sections. He keeps one piece and gives one to the monastery in thanks for its hospitality, and one to Santiago to make up for what he handed over to the tribal commander. The alchemist gives the last piece of gold to the monk to hold on to, in case Santiago should need it in the future. The alchemist leaves Santiago in the desert, telling him no matter what he does, every person on earth plays a central role in the history of the world. And normally he doesn't know it. Santiago rides his horse through the desert for many more hours, trying to listen to it again so as to learn the exact location of the treasure. His heart, however, isn't cooperating, it is thinking about other things. Finally Santiago's heart relents and whispers to him, "Be aware of the place where you were brought to tears. That's where I am, and that's where your treasure is." His horse climbs one more sand dune, and Santiago's heart leaps. He sees the pyramids in front of him, illuminated by the moonlight. Santiago falls to his knees and weeps. He notices that where his tears fell, a scarab, or beetle, now scurries through the sand. Santiago knows that in Egypt, this beetle is considered a symbol of God. Another omen, this must be the place he was meant to dig. Santiago digs through the night, but finds nothing. Some thieves see Santiago digging in the sand and think he is hiding something. They search Santiago's clothes and find the piece of gold that the alchemist gave him. Assuming he must have buried more gold in the sand, they force Santiago to continue digging until the next morning. When he doesn't find any riches, the thieves beat him badly. Santiago screams at them that he is only looking for treasure because he dreamed twice about a buried treasure at the Egyptian pyramids. One of the thieves tells Santiago that he had a recurring dream about a buried treasure, except his dream told him to go to an abandoned church in Spain where shepherds often took their sheep to rest. In my dream, the thief says, there was a sycamore growing out of the ruins of the sacristy, and I was told that, if I dug at the roots of the sycamore, I would find a hidden treasure. But I'm not so stupid as to cross an entire desert just because of a recurrent dream. After the thieves depart, Santiago sits up and starts laughing. He knows where the hidden treasure is buried. Santiago arrives at the abandoned church in his native Andalusia, to which he was able to return with the gold that the alchemist left him at the desert monastery. Digging in the sacristy beneath the sycamore tree, Santiago uncovers a chest of gold coins, precious gems, golden, feathered masks, and stone statues. It's true, he thinks, life really is generous to those who pursue their personal legend. Like so many stories of seekers and their quests, think not only of the Odyssey, but the Wizard of Oz, the alchemist ends where it began. Santiago's treasure was literally under his nose, but he had to travel across a continent to find it. Surely this is central to Coelho's vision, and to this novel's theme. The Alchemist has many themes, but its overriding message is that people must follow their dreams. This novel is full of examples of characters who pursue their dreams, and characters who don't. It is highly appropriate, therefore, that Coelho's book begins with a dream. Coelho's book begins with a dream. Coelho's book begins with